Moscow, August 1987. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she held the 50-ruble note up to the light streaming through her apartment window. Something wasn't right. The paper felt different, smoother, almost too perfect. The watermark seemed correct, the serial numbers looked proper, but 3 decades of handling Soviet currency had given Vera Mikhailovna an instinct for authenticity. This note, fresh from the state bank, felt wrong. She wasn't alone in her suspicion. Across Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev, similar scenes were unfolding as Soviet citizens began examining their money with unprecedented scrutiny. By late 1987, whispers were spreading through breadlines and communal apartments. Someone was flooding the Soviet Union with fake rubles. What Vera and millions of other Soviet citizens didn't know was that the counterfeiting operation wasn't the work of ordinary criminals. It was a deliberate CIA campaign, years in the making, designed to destabilize the Soviet economy at the precise moment when Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to reform it. The false rubles weren't just forgeries. They were economic weapons, and they were about to help bring down an empire. By the time Soviet authorities fully grasped the scale of the operation, billions of counterfeit rubles had infiltrated the economy, creating a crisis of confidence that would accelerate the USSR's economic collapse. The irony was brutal. As Gorbachev pursued glasnost and perestroika, seeking transparency and restructuring, the CIA was ensuring that Soviet citizens couldn't even trust the currency in their wallets. The concept of economic warfare against the Soviet Union wasn't new in 1987, but the sophistication of the CIA's ruble counterfeiting program represented a dramatic escalation in financial sabotage. Intelligence planners in Langley had long understood what President Reagan articulated in a 1983 National Security Council meeting. We can't just contain them anymore. We need to roll them back. We need to hit them where it hurts. Their economy. CIA Director William Casey championed the strategy with characteristic aggression. The Soviet economy is already strained to the breaking point, he told Reagan's cabinet in 1984. They're spending 15 to 20% of their GDP on defense, while their consumer economy is collapsing. If we can undermine confidence in their currency, we accelerate the inevitable. Casey's vision went beyond traditional espionage or military pressure. He wanted to wage war on the Soviet Union's economic foundation itself. The initial planning documents, declassified in 2009, reveal how confident American strategists were in the operation's potential. A 1985 CIA memorandum noted, Soviet currency controls make the ruble uniquely vulnerable to counterfeiting operations. The closed economy, lack of foreign exchange markets, and state control of all financial institutions mean that confidence in the ruble is entirely dependent on state authority. Undermine that confidence, and you undermine the state itself. The Soviets, meanwhile, considered their currency virtually immune to foreign counterfeiting. The ruble's printing techniques, developed over decades in secret facilities, involved specific paper composition, intricate engraving, and security features that Soviet officials believed were impossible to replicate without access to their closely guarded printing plants. KGB Chairman Viktor Shcherbakov expressed this confidence in a 1984 report to the Politburo. Western intelligence services lack the technical capability to produce convincing forgeries of Soviet currency. Our security measures are sufficient. This Soviet confidence was based on reasonable assumptions. The USSR had spent enormous resources developing sophisticated anti-counterfeiting measures. The paper itself came from specific factories using unique fiber combinations. The ink formulas were state secrets. The printing plates were guarded as carefully as nuclear weapons designs. Previous CIA attempts at currency manipulation had been crude and easily detected. What Soviet planners failed to anticipate was the revolution in American technical intelligence capabilities. By the mid-1980s, the National Security Agency had intercepted communications detailing the Soviet papermaking process. CIA operatives had obtained actual ruble samples from multiple production runs, allowing American experts to analyze the paper composition, ink chemistry, and printing techniques with unprecedented precision. More significantly, the CIA had recruited a source inside Goznak, the Soviet state printing authority, a mid-level technical supervisor whose gambling debts made him vulnerable to Western recruitment. The American strategy also reflected evolving Cold War doctrine under Reagan. Previous administrations had focused on containment, accepting the Soviet Union's existence while limiting its expansion. Reagan's team believed in something more aggressive, using economic pressure to force the USSR into a corner. As National Security Advisor John Poindexter explained in a classified 1986 directive, every dollar they waste detecting counterfeits, every hour they spend verifying currency, every percentage point of inflation we can generate. It all diverts resources from their military and accelerates their decline. The timing seemed perfect. Soviet economic problems were already mounting. The Afghan war was draining resources. Falling oil prices, partly engineered by U.S. pressure on Saudi Arabia, were devastating Soviet export revenues. Gorbachev's reform efforts were creating uncertainty and resistance within the Soviet bureaucracy. A currency crisis, CIA planners calculated, could tip the already unstable Soviet economy into chaos. The CIA's path to sophisticated ruble counterfeiting began not with a grand plan, but with an accident. In 1981, during a routine analysis of KGB funding for Western European operations, CIA technical experts in the Office of Technical Service noticed something unexpected. Some of the Soviet currency recovered from arrested Eastern Bloc agents showed subtle variations from standard rubles. Further analysis revealed that even the KGB was using slightly modified currency for covert operations. Bills that were genuine in every way, except for minute differences that allowed Soviet intelligence to track them. This discovery intrigued Dr. Jerome Hauer, a veteran CIA technical officer who had spent his career developing everything from concealment devices to miniaturized cameras. If the Soviets can produce variations of their own currency, Hauer later recalled in his 2003 memoir, then the security features aren't as absolute as they claim. There's flexibility in the system, which means there's vulnerability. Hauer assembled a small team within the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, operating under the bureaucratic cover of Project Hemlock, supposedly focused on analyzing Soviet chemical weapons. In reality, Hemlock's mission was to determine whether high-quality Soviet ruble counterfeiting was technically feasible. The answer, after 18 months of research, was conditional. Yes, but only with access to specific intelligence and materials. The breakthrough came in March 1983. A Soviet defector named Anatoly Zverev, a senior engineer at Goznak's Leningrad facility, contacted the CIA through intermediaries in Finland. Zverev's motives were personal rather than ideological. His daughter had been denied permission to marry a man with distant relatives in the West, and his subsequent protests had earned him official censure. Bitter and disillusioned, Zverev offered something extraordinary: detailed specifications for Soviet currency paper and printing processes. The CIA exfiltrated Zverev through Finland in July 1983, bringing him to a secure facility in Virginia. Over 6 months, he provided his debriefers with extraordinary detail about Soviet currency production. He described the specific paper mills that produced ruble paper, the fiber content, the watermark embedding process, and the quality control procedures. More valuably, he brought with him samples of actual printing plates and ink formulas, smuggled out in a false-bottom toolbox. With Zverev's information, the CIA faced a strategic decision: Simply possessing the capability to counterfeit rubles didn't automatically mean they should do so. A formal review process began in late 1983, involving the directors of Central Intelligence, the National Security Council, and eventually President Reagan himself. The debate was intense. Critics within the intelligence community argued that counterfeiting Soviet currency crossed a fundamental line. CIA General Counsel Stanley Sporkin warned in a December 1983 memo. This operation would constitute economic warfare of a type we've never undertaken. The precedent is dangerous. If we can counterfeit their currency, what prevents them from counterfeiting ours? What prevents other nations from considering currency manipulation a legitimate tool of statecraft? Supporters, led by William Casey, argued that the Soviets were already engaged in economic warfare against the West. Casey pointed to Soviet funding of Western labor unions, support for anti-American movements, and efforts to manipulate commodity markets. They've been waging economic war on us for decades, Casey insisted. We're just leveling the playing field. The legal framework was creatively interpreted. Counterfeiting foreign currency wasn't explicitly prohibited by U.S. law, though it violated international norms. The operation was framed not as counterfeiting, but as monetary influence operations, language that made it sound more like psychological warfare than crime. Reagan approved the operation in February 1984 with strict operational security protocols. The actual production facility was established in a nondescript industrial building in Northern Virginia, operated by a CIA front company ostensibly in the business of secure document printing for government contractors. The cover was perfect. The facility genuinely did produce secure documents, with the ruble operation occupying a carefully compartmented section accessible only to cleared personnel. Building the printing capability took 2 years. The CIA contracted with American paper manufacturers to recreate the Soviet paper formula, sourcing specific fiber types from suppliers who believed they were producing specialized archival paper. The printing equipment itself was custom-built, combining American precision engineering with specifications derived from Zverev's intelligence. The inks required particular attention. Soviet formulas used unique pigment combinations that required months of trial and error to replicate. By mid-1986, the facility was producing rubles virtually indistinguishable from genuine Soviet currency. Initial production runs were tested by having CIA officers attempt to use them in Soviet-controlled facilities in East Berlin and Vienna. The bills passed undetected. Emboldened, the CIA scaled up production, targeting an initial run of several billion rubles, a staggering sum that represented roughly 2 to 3% of the Soviet money supply. The distribution strategy was carefully designed to maximize impact while minimizing the risk of discovery. Rather than simply dumping counterfeit rubles into circulation, the CIA used multiple channels. Some bills entered through covert operatives in Soviet ports, where American intelligence had cultivated assets among dock workers and customs officials. Others were inserted through the Soviet black market, where Western currency dealers traded with Soviet citizens desperate for hard currency. Still others were passed through Eastern European intermediaries who had business relationships inside the USSR. The operation's genius was its subtlety. The counterfeit rubles weren't perfect. They included intentional minor variations that Soviet quality control might miss initially, but would eventually detect. This was deliberate. CIA planners wanted Soviet authorities to find the counterfeits because the discovery would trigger exactly the crisis of confidence they sought to create. The operation's decisive phase began on August 12, 1987, when a sharp-eyed bank teller in Leningrad named Galina Sorokina noticed something odd about a batch of 50-ruble notes. The paper texture was almost imperceptibly different from the notes in adjacent stacks. She reported it to her supervisor, who dismissed her concerns. until 3 more tellers made similar observations over the following week. By late August, the state bank had confirmed what it had desperately hoped to avoid. High-quality counterfeit rubles were circulating in significant quantities. The news reached the KGB on August 29th. Major General Rem Krasilnikov, head of the KGB's second chief directorate, Internal Counterintelligence, immediately grasped the implications. "This isn't ordinary crime," he told his staff in an emergency meeting. "The quality is too high. This is intelligence work." The KGB's investigation moved with unprecedented urgency. Teams of technical experts examined the counterfeit notes, comparing them to genuine currency. What they found was both impressive and terrifying. The counterfeits matched Soviet rubles in nearly every measurable way. The paper composition was accurate to within 2% of the standard formula. The ink chemistry was nearly identical. The printing quality exceeded some of what the Soviets' own facilities produced. Only under microscopic examination could experts identify subtle differences in the engraving depth and paper fiber alignment. "We are facing an adversary with state-level capabilities," Krasilnikov wrote in a September 3rd report to KGB Chairman Viktor Chebrikov. "The technical sophistication indicates Western intelligence, almost certainly American. The volume suggests this is not an isolated operation, but a sustained campaign." The crisis escalated rapidly through September and October 1987. As the KGB investigated, they discovered that counterfeit rubles weren't limited to Leningrad. Reports flooded in from Moscow, Kyiv, Minsk, and Tashkent. Banks across the Soviet Union began finding suspicious notes. The geographic distribution suggested a systematic insertion campaign rather than a single counterfeiting ring. Soviet authorities faced an impossible dilemma. If they publicly acknowledged the counterfeiting, they would trigger panic and undermine confidence in the ruble. If they said nothing, the counterfeits would continue circulating, potentially poisoning the entire monetary system. They chose a middle path: quiet withdrawal of suspicious notes while ordering enhanced verification procedures at all banks and major retailers. This decision played directly into the CIA's strategy. The new verification procedures slowed transactions throughout the Soviet economy. Bank lines, already notorious in the USSR, became longer. Merchants began refusing large bills, suspecting counterfeits. Citizens started hoarding older currency, believing it was more trustworthy. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the actual number of counterfeit notes in circulation. In October 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev learned the full scope of the crisis. The timing was catastrophic for the Soviet leader. He was attempting to implement economic reforms through perestroika, which required citizen confidence in state institutions. The counterfeiting crisis was destroying that confidence precisely when Gorbachev needed it most. "How can we restructure our economy when people don't trust our currency?" he demanded at a Politburo meeting on October 15th. The Soviet response became increasingly desperate. On October 23rd, the state bank announced a comprehensive currency verification program, requiring all citizens to exchange old rubles for new ones at state banks. The announcement claimed this was routine modernization, but Soviet citizens understood what it really meant. The government had lost control of its own money supply. The exchange program began on November 2, 1987, and immediately descended into chaos. Millions of Soviet citizens descended on banks, clutching their savings and demanding new notes. The banks, understaffed and overwhelmed, couldn't process the volume. Lines stretched for blocks. People waited all day, sometimes overnight, to exchange their money. The elderly, who often kept their life savings in cash, were particularly vulnerable. The CIA watched the chaos with satisfaction. Intelligence reports from Moscow Station documented the crisis in detail. A November 8th cable to Langley reported, "Currency exchange program has created widespread public panic. Banks overwhelmed, citizens fighting in queues. Some elderly have died waiting in lines. Economic activity slowing as merchants refuse to accept old currency. Reform programs paralyzed. Target achieved." But the Soviet counteroffensive was also taking shape. KGB technical experts, working around the clock, identified the specific characteristics of the counterfeit notes. They determined that the paper came from Western sources, confirming foreign intelligence involvement. More significantly, they discovered patterns in the serial numbers that suggested the counterfeits came from limited production runs, meaning the operation wasn't infinite. On November 19th, the KGB arrested 3 Soviet citizens working at Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport, charging them with currency smuggling. Under interrogation, one confessed to receiving bundles of rubles from a Western contact and passing them to black market dealers. The trail led to a CIA operative working under diplomatic cover at the U.S. Embassy. The Soviets couldn't arrest him without triggering an international incident, but they could, and did, declare him persona non grata, expelling him from the country. The exposure of the distribution network forced the CIA to halt active insertion of new counterfeits, but the damage was done. By December 1987, the Soviet government estimated that between 3 and 5 billion counterfeit rubles had entered circulation, roughly 3 to 4% of the total money supply. The state bank's response, including the currency exchange and enhanced verification procedures, had cost the Soviet government an estimated 2 billion rubles in administrative expenses alone. More devastating than the direct costs was the psychological impact. Soviet citizens had lost faith in their currency. The black market, already significant, exploded in size as people sought to convert rubles into goods or hard currency as quickly as possible. Barter systems became increasingly common in rural areas. Trust in state institutions, already fraying under Gorbachev's reforms, suffered another severe blow. The crisis also exposed the fundamental weakness of the Soviet economic system. In a market economy, counterfeiting is primarily a law enforcement problem. In a command economy where the state controls all monetary policy, counterfeiting becomes an existential threat. The CIA had exploited this vulnerability perfectly, turning the Soviet Union's economic structure into a weakness rather than a strength. The Soviet response to the counterfeiting crisis evolved from emergency measures to systematic overhaul. But each adaptation revealed new vulnerabilities. In January 1988, the state bank initiated an ambitious currency redesign, planning to introduce new rubles with enhanced security features by 1990. The redesign would cost an estimated 5 billion rubles, money the Soviet government could ill afford given falling oil revenues and mounting defense costs. The KGB launched Operation Shield, a comprehensive counterintelligence program targeting Western financial intelligence operations. Under SHIELD, the KGB increased surveillance of foreign diplomats with financial expertise, tightened controls on currency printing facilities, and established new verification systems at all banks. Major General Krasilnikov's November 1987 directive explained, "We must assume American intelligence has penetrated our monetary systems at multiple levels. Every aspect of currency production and distribution requires security review." Soviet authorities also attempted to track the distribution networks. The KGB identified approximately 40 individuals suspected of involvement in passing counterfeit currency, mostly small-time black market operators who claimed ignorance about their bills' origins. More valuable were the 3 Moscow airport workers arrested in November 1987. Extended interrogation revealed that their Western contact had been operating since early 1986, suggesting the CIA operation had been running for nearly 2 years before detection. The psychological countermeasures were less successful. Soviet television aired public service announcements teaching citizens how to identify counterfeit rubles. But this had the perverse effect of making people scrutinize all currency more carefully, further slowing transactions. Public trust, once lost, proved impossible to restore through propaganda. A confidential Soviet sociological survey from March 1988 found that 63% of urban citizens expressed low or very low confidence in the authenticity of ruble notes, a catastrophic number for a state-controlled economy. The economic ripple effects accelerated through 1988. Inflation, already a problem, worsened as citizens rushed to convert cash into goods. The goods shortage, a chronic feature of Soviet life, became acute as hoarding increased. Black market exchange rates for dollars and Deutsche Marks soared, reflecting collapsing confidence in the ruble. Gorbachev's economic reforms, which required price adjustments and limited market mechanisms, became politically impossible to implement when citizens didn't trust their own currency. Western intelligence agencies watched these developments with intense interest. The CIA's December 1988 assessment noted, "The counterfeiting operation has achieved strategic effects beyond initial projections. Soviet economic dysfunction has accelerated. Popular confidence in state institutions has declined significantly. The operation's continuation is no longer necessary. The damage is self-sustaining." Meanwhile, the CIA faced its own adaptations and constraints. The expulsion of the Moscow station operative and exposure of some distribution networks forced operational changes. More significantly, political pressure within the United States began mounting. Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committees, briefed in closed session about the operation, expressed concerns about international precedent and potential blowback. Senator David Boren, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, raised pointed questions in a January 1988 classified hearing. If we establish that counterfeiting sovereign currency is acceptable intelligence practice, what prevents the Soviets from doing the same to us? What prevents third countries from targeting our currency? CIA General Counsel David Doherty defended the operation's legality under presidential finding authority, but acknowledged the precedent concerns. The operation officially concluded in March 1988, with William Casey, who had died in May 1987, never seeing its full impact. His successor, William Webster, took a more cautious approach to covert economic warfare. Webster ordered all remaining counterfeit currency destroyed and directed that distribution networks be shut down. The printing facility in Virginia was repurposed to legitimate government work. But the CIA's counterfeiting operation had demonstrated a new dimension of Cold War conflict. Economic warfare, previously limited to trade restrictions and technology embargoes, had become direct and aggressive. Intelligence agencies in multiple countries took note. Documents from the French DGSE and British MI6, later declassified, show both services studied the operation and considered similar capabilities against their own adversaries. The Soviets, meanwhile, developed their own counter-currency capabilities. In late 1988, KGB technical experts successfully produced high-quality counterfeit US dollars, though the operation never moved beyond testing phases. The motivation was partially deterrent, demonstrating to American intelligence that the USSR could retaliate in kind, and partially opportunistic, creating a capability for future use. The Eastern European satellites experienced collateral damage. As Soviet currency controls tightened in response to the counterfeiting crisis, trade between the USSR and Warsaw Pact countries became more difficult. The Soviet Union's demand for hard currency payment rather than rubles from its allies accelerated economic strain throughout the Eastern Bloc. Poland, already struggling with debt and economic crisis, found trade with its primary partner more difficult. East Germany, relatively prosperous by Soviet bloc standards, saw its trade surpluses with the USSR complicated by Moscow's currency paranoia. The non-aligned movement nations that maintained trade relationships with Moscow also felt effects. India, a major Soviet trading partner, found that Soviet reluctance to use rubles in trade required more complex barter arrangements. Cuba, heavily dependent on Soviet subsidies, discovered that Moscow's financial crisis meant reduced aid. Vietnam, fighting its occupation of Cambodia with Soviet support, received less economic assistance as Moscow diverted resources to domestic monetary crisis management. By late 1988, Western economic analysts were documenting the cascading effects. A classified CIA assessment from November 1988 concluded, the counterfeiting operation's direct costs to the Soviet economy, roughly 10 billion rubles including detection, exchange programs, and administrative overhead, represent only a fraction of the true impact. Loss of monetary confidence has effectively multiplied the operation's effects by 10-15 times through reduced economic activity, increased hoarding, and accelerated inflation. The operation also influenced Western policy thinking more broadly. The Reagan administration's approach to economic pressure on the Soviet Union became more confident and aggressive. The 1988 National Security Strategy explicitly referenced financial pressure as a component of overall strategy, a shift from previous emphasis on military containment and technological competition. Perhaps most significantly, the counterfeiting crisis demonstrated to Soviet reformers that partial reforms were insufficient. Gorbachev's attempts to preserve the command economy while introducing limited market mechanisms became increasingly untenable when citizens didn't trust the state-controlled currency. The crisis became another factor, among many, pushing Gorbachev toward more radical reforms that would ultimately exceed his control. The counterfeiting operation reached its crescendo during the currency exchange chaos of November-December 1987. But its ultimate significance became clear only over the following 2 years as the Soviet economy spiraled into dysfunction. The peak moment wasn't a single crisis, but a cascading collapse of economic confidence that the counterfeiting operation had accelerated dramatically. By mid-1989, the Soviet government's own internal assessments painted a dire picture. A classified Ministry of Finance report from June 1989 calculated that the counterfeiting crisis and subsequent response had cost the Soviet economy approximately 15 billion rubles in direct and indirect costs, roughly equivalent to 1.5% of GDP. The report noted, the monetary confidence crisis has created self-reinforcing dysfunction. Citizens convert currency to goods immediately, accelerating inflation. Black market activity has increased 40% since 1987. Barter transactions now represent approximately 15% of economic activity in rural areas. The human cost was substantial. Soviet citizens, particularly the elderly on fixed pensions, watched their savings lose value as inflation accelerated. The November 1987 currency exchange, intended to restore confidence, instead traumatized millions who waited in cold weather for hours or days to exchange their money. Soviet Health Ministry records document 127 deaths directly attributable to the exchange program. Elderly citizens who suffered heart attacks or hypothermia while waiting in lines. For Soviet economic planners, the crisis revealed something they had long suspected but hoped to avoid. The command economy could not function without absolute control of monetary policy. Gorbachev's chief economic advisor, Abel Aganbegyan, later wrote in his 1994 memoir, the currency crisis of 1987-88 demonstrated that we could not have both a planned economy and an uncertain currency. The counterfeiting operation, which we knew was American, exploited this fundamental weakness. It proved that our economic system couldn't adapt to external shocks. The CIA's own internal assessment, completed in 1990 after the Berlin Wall fell, evaluated the operation as highly successful in achieving strategic destabilization at minimal risk and cost. The assessment noted, For an investment of approximately $50 million in facility development and $30 million in operational costs, we generated economic disruption valued in the tens of billions of rubles. The operation demonstrated the vulnerability of closed economic systems to monetary warfare. The international implications extended beyond the Cold War. Central banks worldwide studied the Soviet counterfeiting crisis to understand their own vulnerabilities. The U.S. Treasury Department, ironically, became more concerned about foreign counterfeiting of dollars. A 1988 Treasury report to Congress warned, "The Soviet experience demonstrates that even sophisticated security features can be defeated by state-level adversaries with sufficient resources and intelligence access. We must assume that U.S. currency is vulnerable to similar attacks." The operation also marked a turning point in intelligence tradecraft. Economic warfare, previously limited to sanctions, trade restrictions, and technology embargoes, had become direct and covert. The CIA had demonstrated that economic systems themselves could be targeted with specific operations designed to exploit structural weaknesses. This represented a significant expansion of intelligence agency capabilities and authorities. The Soviet Union's response to the crisis consumed resources and attention at precisely the moment when Gorbachev was attempting fundamental reforms. The conservative faction within the Politburo, already suspicious of perestroika, used the currency crisis as evidence that opening the Soviet system invited foreign exploitation. Yegor Ligachev, a leading conservative, argued in a March 1988 Politburo session, "American intelligence has demonstrated that they will attack us through any opening we provide. Economic reform without security is suicide." Yet the counterfeiting crisis also demonstrated the futility of maintaining the closed economic system. The Soviet government's inability to restore monetary confidence, despite massive efforts, showed that command and control were insufficient when citizens lost trust in state institutions. The crisis became another weight on an already overloaded system, accelerating the breakdown that would culminate in the USSR's collapse. By 1990, with the Soviet Union entering its terminal crisis, Western economists and intelligence analysts debated the counterfeiting operation's significance. Some argued it was a decisive blow that accelerated Soviet economic collapse by several years. Others contended it was merely one factor among many: falling oil prices, the Afghan war's costs, the Chernobyl disaster, Gorbachev's political reforms that combined to overwhelm the Soviet system. The truth likely lies between these extremes. The counterfeiting operation didn't cause the Soviet collapse, but it accelerated and intensified the economic crisis at a critical moment. It demonstrated vulnerabilities that Soviet reformers couldn't ignore and conservatives couldn't defend against. It created a monetary crisis that complicated every other economic policy. Most significantly, it shattered whatever remaining confidence Soviet citizens had in their government's basic competence to manage fundamental economic functions. The final irony was strategic. The CIA's counterfeiting operation succeeded so well that it helped trigger Soviet collapse earlier than American planners had anticipated. The George H.W. Bush administration, taking office in January 1989, found itself scrambling to manage a Soviet crisis that was spiraling beyond control. The Cold War's end, when it came, happened faster than either superpower had planned, in part because operations like the ruble counterfeiting had destabilized the Soviet system more thoroughly than anticipated. The CIA's ruble counterfeiting operation remains one of the Cold War's most revealing episodes. Not because it was the decisive factor in Soviet collapse, but because it exemplified how the conflict had evolved by the 1980s into total confrontation across every domain: military, technological, ideological, and economic. The operation demonstrated that even something as fundamental as national currency could become a weapon in superpower conflict. post-Cold War revelations have filled in details previously known only to classified circles. The 2009 declassification of CIA operational documents confirmed the program's scale and sophistication. Russian archives opened during the 1990s provided the Soviet perspective, revealing how thoroughly the operation had disrupted Soviet economic planning and shattered institutional confidence. Former KGB officers, writing memoirs in the 2000s, acknowledged the operation's effectiveness while expressing bitterness at what they viewed as economic terrorism. The operation's lessons extend beyond Cold War history into contemporary statecraft. Modern nations face similar vulnerabilities to economic warfare, albeit in different forms. Cyber attacks on financial systems, cryptocurrency manipulation, and coordinated efforts to undermine national currencies all represent evolution of the tactics pioneered in the 1980s. The fundamental insight remains valid. In an interconnected world, economic confidence is a vulnerability that adversaries can exploit. The ethical questions raised by the operation have never been fully resolved. Was counterfeiting a foreign adversary's currency a legitimate act of intelligence warfare? Or did it cross fundamental lines of international conduct? The operation's architects argued that the Soviet Union had been waging economic war on the West for decades, and the ruble counterfeiting merely responded in kind. Critics contended that deliberately undermining a nation's monetary system, knowing it would harm ordinary citizens, represented a dangerous escalation that established precedents the United States might later regret. For historians of the Cold War's end, the counterfeiting operation illustrates how the conflict's final phase involved coordinated pressure across multiple domains. The Reagan administration's strategy combined military buildup, forcing Soviet defense spending increases, technological competition, strategic defense initiative, support for anti-Soviet movements, Afghanistan, Poland, diplomatic pressure, and economic warfare. The ruble counterfeiting fit within this comprehensive strategy, attacking Soviet economic stability just as other initiatives targeted military capability and political legitimacy. The operation's success also revealed the Soviet system's fundamental fragility. A command economy that controlled all major economic activity couldn't withstand even modest monetary disruption without triggering systemic crisis. The counterfeiting operation exposed what many Western analysts had suspected. The Soviet economy was far weaker than official statistics suggested, held together more by state control than actual productivity or efficiency. Perhaps the operation's deepest lesson concerns the nature of power in the modern world. Military might, nuclear arsenals, and territorial control ultimately mattered less than economic confidence and systemic resilience. The Soviet Union possessed thousands of nuclear weapons, the world's largest army, and control over vast territories. Yet, a few $1 billion worth of high-quality counterfeit currency, inserted systematically over 2 years, contributed to accelerating its collapse. Vera Mikhailovna, the elderly Muscovite whose suspicion about fake rubles opened this story, never learned that her instinct had detected an American intelligence operation. She died in 1993, having survived the Soviet Union's collapse, but seeing her life savings destroyed by the hyperinflation that followed. Her story, multiplied millions of times across the former Soviet Union, represents the human cost of the economic warfare that characterized the Cold War's final years. The counterfeiting operation wasn't the decisive blow that ended the Cold War. No single event was. But it exemplified how comprehensive and merciless the conflict had become by the 1980s. In targeting Soviet currency, the CIA attacked not just an economic system, but citizens' fundamental ability to trust their own government's promises and guarantees. It was economic warfare waged with the precision and ruthlessness of military operations, and it worked precisely because it exploited the Soviet system's deepest structural weaknesses. The operation remains classified in some of its technical details, and certain aspects, particularly the identities of some Soviet sources and the exact printing techniques, remain protected. But enough is now known to understand its significance. In the twilight struggle of the Cold War, even money itself became a weapon, and the side with better counterfeits helped win the economic battle that mattered more than any military confrontation.